Okay. Well, hi everyone, welcome, and it's nice to see you all. At least see your faces and somewhat in person. I hope you can make it to the garden party later that I believe Julie emailed everybody about. If you're in Chicago, please stop by. If you didn't get that, Julie can post the link in the chat. We would love to see you all.
Yes.
So welcome to the PGE BA Symposium, the 2021 virtual, our second annual virtual version, and hopefully it lasts. You're the first cohort to do your entire BA thesis in the remote environment. So congratulations to you all for being able to overcome all of the challenges and the obstacles that have been presented over the last 15 months now, and we are thrilled to have you presenting your thesis today. And I'm going to keep it really short because we have to stay on time, because we have an entire day's worth of presentations between now and 1:30. So we hope that you all can attend the whole day's worth, but for now I'm going to quickly turn it over to our host of this session, which is Professor Allison Anastasia.
Hi, everyone. I am not going to do anything special at all, but introduce each of you this session in our agriculture, environmental, and health session. What I'm going to do, you have a 15-minute slot, so ideally that's 10 minutes for your talk and 5 minutes for questions. I'm going to send you a private message when 8 minutes have gone by, okay? And then if you talk until 14 minutes, that's fine, but I'm going to cut you off so we can move to the next person. I'm going to be brutal. So if people in the audience have questions for our speakers, please reserve them until the end of each individual talk, and there'll be a few minutes for that. So with that, I'm going to introduce Erin Abbott. She did a project on the exploratory spatial data analysis of oyster depletion in the Chesapeake Bay. So Erin, whenever you're ready, please take it away.
Okay, great. I'm just gonna get my screen shared. My voice is a little bit off this morning, so I hope everyone can hear me. All right, good morning. My name is Erin, and I'm an environmental and urban studies major, GIS minor, and presenting my work on my BA thesis titled Exploratory Spatial Data Analysis of Oyster Depletion in the Chesapeake Bay, an effort to recommend reef restoration for dead zone mitigation. This presentation will review the motivation and aims for my study, the data and methods used, and my findings. Ultimately, I will be discussing management recommendations based on the results. Oysters services such as filtering water of organic material and pollutants and supporting other socially and economically important species by providing a habitat. However, there have been massive declines in oyster populations, risking the status of oysters as an important ecosystem member. In a process called eutrophication, agriculture and urbanization have been linked of nitrogen and phosphorus that result in dead zones, which are areas of little to no oxygen in the systems. I chose the Chesapeake Bay as the study area because there is ongoing research and discussion into human impacts on the bay. The map on the left is of the Chesapeake Bay oyster reef system in the late 19th century, which is quite extensive. However, oyster populations have drastically declined over the last century and a half, with landings today at 1. The image on the right helps to visualize stormwater runoff with the parts of the bay that are tan and cloudy, demonstrating where sedimentation that carries pollutants from the land has been deposited. Restoration and repopulation efforts are very important, as oysters, through their filtering abilities, can help with denitrification, mitigating the dead zone. The aim of the study is twofold. The first is to identify areas where dead zones are co-located with oyster reef loss and therefore may have or could result in oyster depopulation. The second is that in identifying these locations, management strategies can be proposed to revive lost oyster reefs and positively impact the bay ecosystem. To approximate a change in oyster reefs related to dead zones, 3 publicly available data sets were identified from the State of Maryland Department of Natural Resources: historic oyster bottom, benthic habitat representing modern oyster bottom, and dead zones. The historic oyster bottom dataset was used to approximate historic reef presence. The benthic habitat dataset allowed for oyster-related seafloor to be selected to represent modern oyster presence. And lastly, the dead zone dataset provided minimum oxygen concentration values at survey points in the bay. Moving on to data processing, the 3 datasets were in a variety of formats. A 50-meter hexagonal grid was selected as the method of standardization to make the dataset manageable in terms of data processing, while also granular enough to capture small-scale changes. In QGIS, the 3 datasets were joined to the hexagonal grid using various intersection methods. Variables created for historic oyster bottom, modern oyster loss, and hypoxia. A continuous variable for dissolved oxygen are created. Then exploratory spatial data analysis was performed using GEODA, including univariate and bivariate visualizations and global and local spatial autocorrelation testing. The resulting grid contained 19,190 units after cleaning and is displayed here with the surrounding land area in Maryland to provide context to the location of the. The 3 binary variables were visualized using unique value maps seen here. For historic oyster reef presence, 26.2% of the units historically had oysters. For modern oyster presence in B, and the 15.65% of the grid units had modern oyster presence. And while approximately 40% of the historic oyster reefs were lost between historic and modern times, 20% were completely lost and another 20% were relocated from areas that were just not historically reefs. In general, oysters were found in more shallow water and therefore not in the center of the bay where the depth is the greatest. For the summary statistics for the continuous dissolved oxygen variable, the values ranged from 0.15 milligrams per liter to over 10 milligrams per liter of dissolved oxygen, meaning with a mean of 4.71 milligrams per liter. In the histogram in A, with custom breaks using concentration ranges from the literature, there were 4,800 representing the hypoxic or deadly areas, and 2,681 units in the highest 2 bins representing the healthy to somewhat oversaturated units. Through the Corpath maps in B, the highest 2 bins of values were more spatially distributed throughout the bay and appeared on both shorelines, while the lowest bin appeared more spatially clustered within the center of the bay. The global Moran's eye statistic concentration variable is shown here for 6 different spatial weights. Each test was run with 9,999 permutations, and the p-values were all 0.0001. This indicated that the dissolved oxygen concentration variable was highly spatially autocorrelated and rejected the null hypothesis of spatial randomness. The weights with the highest z-values were Queen's 6th order and minimum distance band, with both had z-values of approximately 650. The minimum distance band did not have any neighborless observations, which is ideal for cluster analysis, so it is used for the remainder of the analysis. The locations of significant clusters of the dissolved oxygen concentration variable were then determined using local spatial autocorrelation. For the univariate local Moran's eye, using the minimum distance weight with 9,999 permutations, the cold spots were found near the center of the bay in deeper water, and the hot spots were found along the shoreline. Also, based on the significance map, about 75% of the cores were locally autocorrelated. Then the results of the local joint count statistic for the 3 binary variables using the minimum distance band and 9,999 permutations is seen here. At a significance level of p equals 0.0001, there were significant cores for historic reefs in A, modern reefs in B, and loss in C. Excuse me. The area in the north part of the bay is circled in red near Baltimore, and this area highlights where there is a large area of oyster gain with very few areas of loss occurring. And then comparatively, in the southeast area of the bay, denoted with the blue circles, significant oyster loss was seen here. Lastly, multivariate analysis for different combinations of the 4 binary variables was performed. In the collocation maps here, the bright colors indicate where both variables were present, the gray indicates where both were absent, and the light blue is where the values were opposite. For the historic and modern collocation map in A, the dark blue is oyster persistence from historic to modern times, In B, the red indicates oyster loss in dead zones, and in C, the pink represents modern presence in dead zones. Lastly, the resulting significance maps from multivariate co-location joint count statistics with 9,999 permutations at p equals 0.0001 are depicted here. In B, 129 significant cores were identified as locations for restoration due to loss in dead zones. In C, 33 significant cores were identified as locations for monitoring due to presence in dead zones. Overall, the significant cores identified for management are approximately 110 kilometers squared for restoration and 30 kilometers squared for monitoring. And while these are not the only areas in need of intervention in the Bay, the hope is that this is a more manageable and precise area of the Bay to efficiently focus efforts. Overall, the spatial perspective provided through this analysis helps to build an understanding of oysters and dead zones within the Chesapeake Bay to aid in investigating the broader negative impacts of human-related eutrophication and potential management strategies. Of the analysis were: 1, oyster presence in historic and modern times were clustered and dissolved oxygen concentration was spatially autocorrelated. 2, oyster loss was not uniformly distributed throughout the Bay. And 3, there were statistically significant co-locations for both modern oyster presence and oyster loss within hypoxic areas. The identification of these significant areas of oyster depletion and presence in dead zones is intended to motivate interventions for restoration and monitoring, respectively. From the exploratory analysis, it does seem as though low oxygen may be a factor influencing oyster loss in these specific areas of the Bay, but this relationship does not hold for all areas of oyster loss. Also, because this is exploratory data analysis, it is not confirmatory, and so these locations found cannot be said to have been causally influenced by dead zones, as there may be other factors at play in the system that still need to be studied. There have been many restoration programs that have been found to be beneficial for oyster reefs in the surrounding ecology. An interesting dichotomy with human impacts on oysters is that while humans, through overharvesting and eutrophication, have played a role in oyster depletion, oyster populations provide immense benefits to humans. Restoring oysters in the Bay would help to reduce excess nitrogen to mitigate dead zone formation, while also supporting biodiversity, acting as a safeguard for commercial fishing jobs and local economies from increased fishery production. As an adjunct to other eutrophication control methods on land, targeted oyster restoration would be a win-win for the ecosystem and the local communities of the Chesapeake Bay. I want to thank Dr. Marina Kolak and Matthew Nisley for their feedback and support throughout the academic year. Thank you for your attention, and I will take any questions at this time.
Thank you, Erin. That was great. And I cannot believe you were literally exactly 10 minutes. So good job of practicing. I would love to take any questions from the audience if you just want to raise your hand. Evan, please go ahead.
This is a really dumb question and is like clearly going to out me as a an inlander. But your final image here is, you know, of oysters on ice prepared to be served here. Are all oysters eating oysters, or are the kinds of oysters that would be, you know, used in projects like yours different kinds of oysters? You know, would there be sort of like a agricultural angle to what you're discussing here?
Yeah, definitely. One consideration is that with restoration projects, to see these benefits, we need a massive boom in the population. So I would recommend waiting a little bit before starting to harvest these oysters, because harvesting them for eating will just deplete the populations again. But yeah, oysters, I think to my knowledge, all oysters are edible. I think some might be a little more susceptible to the poor water conditions that they're in and maybe not as yummy. But that's something down the line as the reefs are restored to their full density that this could become another location for harvesting.
Thank you, Erin. Other questions before we move on? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Erin, for your presentation.
Allison, could I jump in
Yep.
really quickly?
Oh, of course, yes.
Matthew. One thing I wanted, this was a great presentation, thank you. And one thing I wanted to say is that occurred to me as you were giving it, and I think you played it up in the conclusion, and I think you could actually incorporate it into the thesis if you're wanting to publish it, is the importance of scale in things like ecological studies. So at a large scale, many of us have heard that oxygen depletion is a problem. When you actually zoom in to a finer grain resolution in a place like the Chesapeake Bay, you actually see that there's a very complicated picture going on. And I think that you were able to explore that very effectively. But one of the ways that you could pitch this is, I think it's great that you're able to isolate these small areas for mitigation or restoration. But I think it also speaks to the fact that it can give support to sort of small scale initiatives, not always like Bay-wide level initiatives to fix these things, because some of the changes are actually happening on a very small scale, as your study was able to point out. And I think that's also a very important finding that you shouldn't downplay.
Thank you.
Yeah, great point. Thank you, Matthew. That there is a large degree of heterogeneity in the Chesapeake Bay, and as well as some autocorrelation. Thank you, Erin. Next up, we have Lizzie Fierro. She's going to talk to us about maybe quote unquote natural disasters. Take it away, Lizzie.
Can you guys see this?
Almost. Yes.
Okay, cool. Oh, sorry. Yes, so hi everyone, my name is Elizabeth Fierro. I'm presenting my thesis, God's Plan for the Planet, a case study of religious attitudes towards climate change exacerbated natural disasters. I apologize for the lack of images in this, as I don't really have any maps or anything to share, but my question was inspired by a class called Is Humanity Doomed? Taught by David Barr. I took it last spring, and it was incredible. And the question that I wanted to talk about was the relationship between natural disasters, religious beliefs, and climate change. So natural disasters are significant to the mythology of many religions and belief systems. Houses of worship often play a critical role in disaster relief efforts. And through the emerging field of extreme event attribution, natural disasters are being ever more tied to avoidable human activity. And so the question is, are religious reactions to natural disasters or religious relationships to the environment changing in response to this link between natural disasters and human activity? Does the increasingly apparent link between natural disasters and climate change result in certain religious communities placing a higher value on environmental stewardship, or more frequently expressing a reverence for the natural world? If so, are those responses universal, or can they be predicted based on other characteristics of the community? So here's a little visualization I made for the thesis, kind of explaining the relationship between these three things. Natural disasters obviously refer to major events caused by natural processes. Extreme events are a subcategory of natural disasters referring to destructive weather. And then climate change, we all know what climate change is. And climate change, extreme weather events specifically, are becoming more frequent and severe due to human-caused climate change. Religious beliefs refer to someone's interpretation of the divine and their relationship to it, can play a significant role in cultivating one's values and behaviors. And belief in climate change or inspiration to take action again can be affected by one's religious beliefs. And of course, people turn to religious beliefs for comfort in response to disasters or for justifications as to why they occurred. So the question is, how do natural disasters exacerbated by climate change affect people's religious beliefs? So my project design, I conducted a discourse analysis on communications materials released by various mainstream Protestant Christian congregations in the Houston area from 6 months before Hurricane Harvey to 6 months after Hurricane Harvey. I used the political alignment of the congregations as an avenue for deciphering trends in the discourse. Political alignment is often used as a way to predict someone's relationship to the environment and to climate change, it's a stronger indicator than a lot of other things like race. Do the religious responses to Hurricane Harvey differ between conservative, moderate, and liberal congregations? Do they display differing spiritual relationships to the environment either before or after Hurricane Harvey? I chose Hurricane Harvey because it is a recent natural disaster, very much linked to climate change, and partially because it's quite close to home for me since I'm from Texas. I expected to find an increase in discussions about environmental stewardship, reverence for the natural world, and human responsibility regarding climate change in the post-Harvey content. And I expected that to be primarily concentrated in content released by liberal congregations. And the results were that there were not any conclusive correlation between the political alignment of the congregations and their attitude toward the topics. However, there was increased conversation on the subjects, even if they were not necessarily confined to congregations of one political alignment or another. The content released before the hurricane addressed these topics in relatively similar amounts across the political spectrum. The content released after the hurricane indicated a potential partisan trend, with like the majority of discussion on the topics coming from liberal churches, except there was one moderate church which really dominated the conversation. So I felt that it was not really appropriate to draw conclusions about partisan trends from the results of this specific project. So this is an example of a quote from the pre-Harvey content. Loving God, your creation reminds us of your majesty. When we consider everything you made, we are in awe. Help us steward all that you have given. So I saw a lot of conversation about stewardship in the pre-Harvey content. A lot of it was not quite as explicit as this, but I did find it interesting that these topics were still talked about in the pre-Harvey content. And then some examples of post-Harvey content. This year, darkness seems especially impregnable. The impact of Hurricane Harvey is settling onto our community as we move from responsive mode to recovery. The trauma is taking new forms. Globally, there's talk of nuclear war, climate change, Middle East destruction from years of war. Nationally, we are living with strained politics and economic uncertainty. We are living with gloom. So in the post-Harvey content, there was a lot of content that connected the natural disaster to other human-caused disasters, such as nuclear war, climate change, Middle East destruction, a lot of political content, given that this was shortly after Trump was elected. And so I found it really interesting that a lot of these explorations of the effect of the natural disaster explicitly linked it to other human-caused disasters. And then, Father God, thanks for this wonderful earth that you have blessed us to live in and care for. Teach us how to be better stewards of our planet in order that our children will live well after we have left. So this was something released, I think, not more than 2 weeks after the natural disaster, after the hurricane. And so I found that extremely interesting how immediate this response had been. And then some limitations and suggestions for my thesis. Political categorization of congregations can be inaccurate. I went about this by looking at things like Yelp reviews, website content, and mainly had to go off of various indicators like affirmation of the LGBTQ community on their website, things like that. And of course, that can be inaccurate and it's hard to generalize an entire community. Content can be published sporadically or have varying numbers of contributors. Some of the content was like sermons, which are generally contributed to by one or two people. Others were newsletters, which took like many contributors from the community. There are also geographic and temporal limitations. Obviously, I was limited to communities that were directly affected by Hurricane Harvey. And of course, for the scope of the thesis, I had to make the temporal limitation 6 months before and 6 months after, which I think had I had a wider scope, it could have perhaps revealed more. Conducting interviews might be a successful method for future projects on the same topic. I think also there are options for sort of like coding, categorizing these things based on like different codes, which I did not do in this thesis, but could very well be an interesting avenue to explore. And then there's also value in exploring the question as it pertains to other religious communities and other events. I chose Protestant Christianity because of its influence on American society throughout history, its popularity in the US, and the fact that it is most directly linked to attitudes about climate change, whereas other religions don't have such a strong indicator. But there's obviously lots of value in exploring this question in various ways. So my conclusion, although my hypothesis about political orientation was not confirmed, the project has nevertheless highlighted the importance of continuing research on the intersection of climate change, natural disasters, and religious beliefs. Houses of worship remain a critical presence for the communities in the wake of natural disasters, and natural disasters will always pose questions to people of faith about the nature of suffering and the relationship between God and humanity. As climate change continues to intensify natural disasters, and as the connection between natural disasters and human activity further permeates the social consciousness of our nation, the effects of this relationship on individuals' religious beliefs and on the general attitudes of religious communities will only become more clear. My results demonstrate that these effects are already taking shape through increased discussion of environmental stewardship, through both implicit and explicit acknowledgement of climate change, and through reflection on contemporary traumas. Further research on the subject could provide important context for future environmental efforts that hope to target faith-based communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lizzie. That was terrific. So you did a, an analysis, right, of a textual analysis. Maybe can you zoom out a little bit and just tell us about your sort of personal, maybe you showed us some really interesting quotes. Were there any parts during your research that you felt were personally really interesting that maybe did or didn't fit in with your actual thesis that you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that was really difficult for me was just reading like tons and tons of conservative religious blogs, just based off my background. But yeah, I think it was very interesting to see how extremely different the types of communities reacted to not just the natural disaster, but pretty much any topic they wrote about. Obviously, there were ways in which they intersected a lot, but it was extremely interesting and kind of like a crash course in like contemporary American Protestant Christianity. So I did find that extremely fascinating, and it was at times an emotionally draining experience, but also really enlightening.
Excellent, thank you. And we're happy to take questions from the audience, please. You can raise your hand or just yell. Evan, please.
I'm wondering whether, so I mean, I totally understand why you focused on Protestants for the US context, but I'm wondering what impact you saw, if at all, of Pope Francis, who's famously environmentalist, and who, was it 2014 or 2015 released this, amazing document sort of outlining, how he thinks, Catholicism helps us be environmentalists. Yeah, any resonances there?
Yeah, I didn't really see none of the content that I read really addressed that, but I did in my preliminary research do a lot of research on like various religions and their attitudes towards the environment and towards climate change, and read a lot about that during that period, and also a lot about other sort of religious environmental movements, which actually I think we talked about this in sustainable urban development a little bit, and probably was like a seed in planning this thesis. So yeah, I think that there's definitely a lot of value in exploring this question further through other religions, and I think Catholicism would be a fascinating one to explore specifically.
Excellent. Chris, did I see that you had a question, please?
I do. So in religious studies, one of the tensions that we're always looking at is this sort of authority structure tension, right? You have the institutional lines of authority, usually represented by ordained or otherwise designated leaders of ministry. But then on the other hand, you also in religious traditions specifically have sort of charismatic traditions of leadership, people who rise up and are inspired in some way, and that gives them a certain kind of authority. As you were looking at your texts and kind of trying to decide what to weigh more heavily, what sources of authority did you find yourself engaging with on this issue, and where did you find messaging was coming from? Was this coming from the pews or was it coming from the pulpit?
Yeah, that was definitely a consideration throughout this process. I did find that several of the content sources were primarily written by church leadership, which was not ideal. But what I found most interesting was that the one church that kind of dominated the conversation post Hurricane Harvey was actually the content I was looking at with that church was a newsletter which sought contributions from the congregation. And specifically, they had a section at the end of every newsletter where people, members of the church would send out prayers or thoughts for the following week. And so that was a really rich source of content for me because it was just, it drew from so many different people and people felt free to say what was truly on their mind. And so I think in the future, perhaps if this question were explored with a wider scope or perhaps if someone decided to do interviews, I think that could be a potential way to eliminate some of the tension between leadership and members of the church.
Great question. Thank you so much, Lizzie. And we are going to move on to our next talk. So please join me in welcoming Chase Gardner to talk to us about the first in two pieces about agriculture. Talking to Corn Belt farmers. Chase, please.
Yeah, so let me just share my screen. All right, can everyone see that?
Yes.
So yeah, my thesis is climate risk and cultivation, how US Corn Belt farmers perceive and respond to weather-related risks. Sorry. Yeah, so the main problem that I kind of came across was that row crop farmers, staple crop farmers, basically people who cultivate things like corn, rice, soybeans are kind of some of the three main ones worldwide. So these kind of farmers in developed countries are pretty underrepresented in ethnographic research, and particularly research that engages with them through interviews. And so thus we know comparatively little about how they understand weather-related risk, how this influences their cultivation decisions, and the different ways in which they perceive the world. And so this is important because I think a better understanding of their opinions and their thought processes is essential to communicating more productively, with these kind of farmers about, very important issues to both them and us, like climate change. So I focused on farmers in the US Corn Belt, specifically, like corn and soybean farmers. This is just an outline. The darker areas here represent where the most corn was harvested in 2019 as an example, but it's a pretty clear representation of the Corn Belt in the US, mainly centered around Iowa, and a few other states in the Midwest are predominantly featured. So the questions I had that kind of framed this thesis were, how do these kinds of farmers understand the risk that weather poses to their operations? How do they decide how to mitigate the risk to the extent that they can? And what do they think are the greatest threats to the future of their practice? This could include climate change, maybe characterizing the shifting weather patterns or other factors. So the methods for this, I conducted 45 to 75-minute interviews with farmers in the US Corn Belt. These were over the phone. One was over Zoom. I asked them about their farming background, how weather impacted their operations, what they did to limit weather risks, what about the future worried them, why, and so forth. Most of the questions I had were pretty open-ended, so there was a lot of room for the farmers involved to, focus in on things that were especially important to them, or add things that I wasn't even asking about in the first place. And then afterwards, I coded all of the interviews, to find some broader themes that emerged from the data. And so this is just a zoom in on where I interviewed farmers. I ended up having 6 interviews in total in kind of 5 different county clusters. The larger one in northern Iowa is where I ended up interviewing 2 people. And they were farming tracts of land ranging from 220 to over 3,000 acres. So that kind of, just to give it some context, is kind of the upper end of a slightly smaller scale farmer / the lower end of like a medium-sized farm to like a very large production. But these were all family-owned operations. It was one or several people who were farming this land or owned the land. So it wasn't like it wasn't a commercial operation. These were all family-owned setups. And so these are just some of the results that I had. So with regards to weather and risk and just perceptions of those things, farmers in the study were, unsurprisingly, at the mercy of weather. It was by far the greatest risk to a successful harvest, in their view, and in pretty much everyone's view. Some interesting things relating to weather patterns were that some farmers were uncertain that weather patterns had changed over the course of their time farming, which for many of the people interviewed was decades, or they were uncertain going back to their parents' time if the weather had changed over that time scale. Whereas others actually noticed that conditions were becoming more extreme in their areas. I think something that's interesting, though, that I kind of found after going back through these interviews was that a similar thinking united these different conclusions. And that was that farmers tended to place kind of the greatest trust in personal or their own lived experience when coming to these conclusions about weather patterns in their area, conclusions about climate change. And this could also include the lived experience of a direct family member, like one of their parents. So farmers remained very aware of like broader climate change narratives, but often, due to their own personal experience, which could differ from those narratives, they were either skeptical of those conclusions or had their own interpretations. This is just kind of one representative quote of someone who actually does believe in climate change, or did, and expressed that, but really based it in his own experience. And it's kind of a long quote, so I won't go through the whole thing, but basically he's just saying, like, going back to his childhood, he remembers these winters, these very regular patterns of cold and snow and like very regular seasons. And now he's just saying, I don't know what to expect. I don't know what's going to happen. Sometimes we have warm weather, and it's just, what's happening today isn't normal compared to what he remembers for many, many years when he was a child. And that's a pretty representative, justification for, noticing and making conclusions about weather patterns. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so this, so with regards to how farmers then like manage the risk and the kind of different weather tensions that they were seeing, something interesting that came up was that a lot of these decisions on risk mitigation were very economically motivated, or at least framed in economic terms. I think farming as a business, a lot of farmers expressed that it's okay to have a mediocre year. It's okay to have several mediocre years in a row, but generally it's all about avoiding a catastrophic year. And so thus a lot of the language was around being financially conservative, spreading out risk, and making sure all their eggs weren't in one basket was a pretty common phrase that came up in terms of how they thought about it. And kind of an interesting addendum to that, farmers with greater financial flexibility, some owned all of their own land, some didn't, but those that had a little bit more financial flexibility it felt they were able to take more risks in their cultivation, or with other like insurance strategies. So, often these strategies were evaluated as kind of, people use the language of return on investment a lot. That's how they thought about it. So that was true for whether they were buying, how they viewed crop insurance, how they viewed buying new technologies, and also, how they tried out new cultivation practices like different tilling or irrigation techniques. So I think one really interesting wrinkle that came up and kind of complicated this purely financial picture, though, was the importance of family and, passing down the farm. Multi-generational responsibility, is kind of, I phrased it, was definitely something that almost all the Farmers Express brought a purpose to their farming beyond economics. So most all the farmers that I interviewed, their land had become much more valuable over the course of their time farming, and if they were, if they chose to sell it, that would be a huge financial gain to them and would obviously, it would just be, given the way that they framed a lot of these, risk mitigation strategies in financial terms, it would be a very good economic decision for them. But due to the importance of passing the farm down, due to the importance of their children inheriting the farm, that decision just didn't even cross their mind. And so, the family kind of became more important than, just economics. So looking towards the future, farmers kind of identified two threats to their practice that they were really worried about. One was that you can phrase it as the federal government and the general public want to enact legislation or environmental initiatives that will, impact farmers, but without pausing to understand the perspective of farmers themselves. So essentially, there were several farmers that I interviewed that just feared that their voices were not being heard, and they weren't entirely sure what to do about it. But it's something that kind of I felt like justified the thesis a little bit, was that they appreciated like talking to me and talking to someone who they knew probably had different opinions on all of these issues than they did, and being able to share their thoughts. So that was a little bit validating. And a second threat for the future that these farmers identified were that local soil and water resources basically are being compromised by expanding human development and farmers who don't really care for their land. And so they kind of, almost all the farmers that I talked to kind of brought this up in some way or another. And I think it's interesting that they felt like they had more control over this specific, threat to the future of farming. And I kind of classified their response as one of like stewardship. And so I use that word because I think it pretty accurately reflects, how they value their land, how they feel responsible for it, and how they recognize their active role in its continued health. So a lot of their responses were changing their cultivation practices in ways that benefited their land and their bottom line simultaneously. They were still worried about that financial perspective, but they were definitely also very interested in incorporating practices that they felt were better for the continued health of their soil and their water. So just some quick conclusions. A really big surprise to me that, well, not a huge surprise, but despite how important climate change might be to these farmers going forward, they weren't really concerned with it. Even farmers who did express a belief in climate change didn't think it would be a huge deal going forward. And I was also surprised that despite the size and the industrial techniques used by a lot of these farmers, they still had a deep stewardship mentality towards their land. So just some maybe quick suggestions about communicating climate change with these farmers going forward. State or local, future climate policy could come more from state or local governments, as I think these farmers were more distrustful of federal actors and felt that people who were closer to home knew them better, knew the nuances of their practice better. I think it could also be really interesting. Future research could explore the effectiveness of farmers who do believe in climate change and farmers who don't, communicating with each other and sharing their personal experiences with each other. And I think just for anyone who wants to talk to farmers about climate change going forwards, I think just beginning by acknowledging shared values about the land and about environmental resources and about local environmental health is just an important way to start, and just start off on the right foot in acknowledgement of shared values. So that's the end. Sorry.
We have time for one quick question.
Oh.
Ray, please.
No, don't make it mine.
Oh, okay.
Unless there's not another one. Okay, my question
Please go ahead.
your statement about they didn't want to put all their eggs in one basket. Was that did that result in crop cultivation? And was crop cultivation different under these conditions than it had been previously?
Yeah, all the eggs in one basket, like farmers are definitely planting multiple crops in a year, so that people would typically have a corn harvest and a soybean harvest. And they would the corn is kind of the moneymaker. The soybean is more of just, you have to do it for, so the crop chemistry or the soil chemistry ends up working out year to year. And farmers try to play it so they can plant more corn in a year if they can. But, they're definitely planting multiple crops in a year because like the soil chemistry won't work out, and they didn't want to risk having all their resources just in eggs in one basket. So that's kind of how that plays out in terms of the crop selection.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Ray and Chase. And Chase, thank you for making a really great segue into our next speaker. Devin McNulty is going to talk specifically about soil loss in farms in Illinois as the result of agriculture, and specifically speaking, I think, a little bit to what you said, which is the economic motivation of how we talk about soil, at least in a farming context. So Devin, please, when you are ready, take it away.
Yeah, hi everyone. Apologies for my voice. I've got a cold right now. I'm gonna share my screen. Sorry, I just need to move all of your faces out of the way. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to be presenting my thesis titled Soil Loss in Illinois, a Continual Crisis in Industrial Agriculture. So just to introduce it, maybe you've seen this headline, maybe you haven't, that there is only 60 years left of farming if soil degradation continues. And this is kind of like a big wow headline, but there's been some pretty solid refutations of it that it's not essentially backed up by scientific evidence. But that's not to say that soil loss is not a serious problem and something to be concerned about. And there are some real concerns backed up by evidence that we should take into consideration. For example, that under conventional agricultural practices, there are some soils that may not last more than 100 years. On the average conventional plowed field, soil is eroding 10 to 100 times faster than it's being produced. So there is a net loss of soil on those farms. And in the US Corn Belt, about 35% of cultivated cropland has already lost, completely lost sort of the topsoil layer and is farming on the sort of less fertile subsoil layer. And so the problem that I identify is that though that the average Corn Belt farm may have more than 60 years of topsoil left, there is still already severe erosion that has happened in the past due to past agricultural practices. And current erosion continues to be a threat based on measurements of current soil erosion. So that's a threat to the long-term viability of those soils. And soil loss is exceeding the rates of production in Illinois, on many soils in Illinois. And industrial agricultural methods do not seem suited to address this issue. In fact, it seems that they may be contributing to this crisis. So a brief little bit of background. Soil loss has been happening, erosion has been happening for a long time, for thousands of years. Like civilizations have had to deal with this issue, and it's no different in Illinois. And it can look like maybe not necessarily a huge amount of soil loss, but when it rains, a lot can be washed away very quickly. Or if the soil is dry, wind can blow it away very quickly. So it can quickly become something very dramatic. This isn't something we see so much anymore, but was certainly a huge issue in sort of destroying the agricultural viability of soils. Nowadays, we might see just more of a slow runoff of soil, which slowly degrades the soil over time and reduces its depth and fertility as nutrients run off. So my study area is Illinois. Illinois is an interesting area because as far as like intensive agricultural cultivation goes in Illinois or in the US. It was sort of the first of these huge, first of like the Corn Belt states to become under cultivation as Euro-American settlers displaced indigenous peoples and began cultivating the land here. They brought the plow, they plowed up the soil, and since then, soil loss has been a serious issue. Briefly before that, it's useful to understand sort of what the vegetation was like on the land before it became a monoculture of corn and soybeans. And so this sort of light yellow area is tallgrass prairie and oak hickory forests, and the green is oak hickory forests. So these are kind of the two broad regions which we're dealing with. And now that has almost completely been replaced, or at least the prairie part has almost been completely replaced by corn and soybeans. There's something like 0.1% of the tallgrass prairie remaining in Illinois. So my aim is to try and understand the relationship between industrial agriculture and soil loss as much as I can, and specifically try and identify and illustrate the spatial distribution of soil loss and industrial agricultural production over time in Illinois to draw out some patterns and conclusions. The over time part is very important because this is a very long-term process. It's sort of like almost beyond our lifetimes at sort of the rates that this is happening. And so trying to look at it in sort of as long-term of a view as possible is really important, rather than just looking at sort of the yearly day-by-day erosion. So as far as methodology goes, I combed through publicly available data sets of soil erosion surveys and historical documents from national, federal, and state organizations, as well as like university organizations that did research and surveys, sort of trying to quantify and map soil erosion. And so the surveys which I returned from that sort of coming through that were useful to this study were soil surveys done between 1902 and 1928 in Illinois, the 1934 National Reconnaissance Erosion Survey, the National Resources Inventory, which is ongoing and began in 1977, but the first results were published from 1982, and Illinois' own Soil Conservation Transect Survey. And so I gathered data from all of those. They are in wildly different formats. Some of them are descriptive, some of them are quantitative. But the one thing they have in common is that they can be put on a map of Illinois, which is what I did. And so we can kind of compare the patterns over time. So first of all, sort of the first results we have specific to Illinois, as far as soil erosion goes, is this description of land being deemed broken and hilly and subject to severe erosion. So this was kind of like a visual survey done between 1902 and 1928. And we can see that there's some serious problem regions along the west and in the south, where more than 50% of the land was deemed broken and hilly, which was becoming not suitable for agriculture. But we also see it sort of in sort of the central and eastern regions as well. So it's not just isolated to a few areas. It is like, it is sort of a broader issue. The National Reconnaissance Survey did this sort of similar methodology where they quantified sort of little to no erosion, moderate or severe. The purple is severe, so down in the south, there is a region of severe erosion, but moderate erosion can be found sort of across the state. So there are significant concerns in many areas. Beginning in 1982, we can kind of put some numbers to it. And so we do see that in 1982, soil erosion rates were relatively high, but did decrease over the course of about 10 years. And by sort of 1997, 2002, they had decreased a significant amount. And so lots of improvements were made. And these were kind of like some of the things that Chase, I think, mentioned with respect to farmers wanting to use both soil conservation methods and sort of increase their yield, increase their profitability. And there was, to a certain extent, you can do that. Certain soil conservation methods do help. It's it's not very beneficial to the farmer to have lots of soil running off. But we can also see that those sort of improvements have kind of come to a halt and kind of kept steady around a certain rate of erosion. And so we might want to ask ourselves, okay, is this rate of erosion sustainable or not? This is sort of that same data, but plotted on a map, and we can see that sort of those same areas continue to be kind of the areas of highest erosion, and then central Illinois area of lowest erosion. By the Illinois Soil Conservation Transect Survey, they essentially quantify what a sustainable rate of soil erosion to be as this tolerable rate. And the tolerable rate is sort of set nationally between 1 and 5 tons per acre. And they find that there's significant amounts, up to like 64% of their survey points had rates that were exceeding this tolerable rate. So clearly it's not sustainable by that measure. However, there's also issues with that measure. Many soil scientists will say that it's essentially not backed up by science, and that really the rate should be, the sustainable rate should be a lot lower. So this is probably a serious underestimation of sort of what sustainable, what is unsustainable about these rates of soil erosion. So in the interest of time, I'll try and be a little quick, but we can kind of see that some of this relates to environmental factors. The two different soil types in Illinois are broadly the soils that were under forests and the soils that were under prairie. And that correlates a lot with where there's high erosion and where there's not. This also correlates a lot with hilliness. So slope means that soil can run off a lot easier, as well as increased rainfall in the south, which also increases erosion. So those are certainly some of the factors affecting it. Broadly speaking, we see that corn yields have increased despite erosion, even though we might expect erosion to decrease corn yields. Sort of adding industrial inputs has been able to make up for that and sort of mask the effects of erosion. So fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides have made up for like the lost nutrients in the topsoil as it runs off. And this kind of occurs broadly across the state. And lastly, sort of the sort of conventional versus conservation tillage practices. Conventional tillage is still highly practiced in sort of the central region where there's like less erosion. So kind of like the logic there might be, since they are able to get away with lower rates of erosion, they can continue conventional tillage, whereas regions where erosion is more of a concern, they are using conservation tillage. But despite using conservation tillage, these regions still have high rates of erosion. And so to conclude, soil survey results across an extended period show that there's a real challenge in approaching this environmental crisis, but there has been some progress with conservation methods. The history and current trajectory of agriculture and the relationship it produces with the land seem to be unsustainable. Each of the soil surveys reviewed in this analysis recorded a serious crisis on Illinois soils. And there is some hope in the adoption of no-till, cover cropping, and other conservation methods. So maybe there is a way out of soil erosion under industrial agriculture, but they're not being implemented everywhere. And in some places, they may actually affect short-term yield. And so there might not be an incentive to practice them. So if we don't reorient soil conservation and agriculture away from this emphasis on productivity, the soil tolerance and short-term perspectives, it is difficult to see how to solve this crisis. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Devin. We have time for a very, very brief question before we move on. If any exist. Okay, thank you, Devin. Asha is going to speak to us next about differential impacts of water privatization in sub-Saharan Africa. So Asha, yes, please, as soon as you're ready, take it away. Asha, we can't hear you.
Are you, as the host, Julie, able to unmute Asha, or?
I think she's unmuted. I think that there's just
Yeah.
something is wrong with her sound.
Asha, I wonder if maybe you try closing out of the meeting and rejoining. That might help.
Or that.
It wouldn't be a Zoom symposium without some technical difficulties.
Indeed.
But thanks to Allison, we are on good time here. So.
Yeah, I wish I had a song to sing or something, but
Is Devin still there?
is Devin still there?
And if not, that's okay.
Oh yeah, I'm still here. Sorry, I was blowing my nose.
I could ask a question while we're waiting. Oh no, Asha's back. I'll put it to you in the chat.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm so sorry. Sorry.
No problem, no worries. You got this.
So basically the research that kind of, the thing that kind of motivated this paper was the fact that for a long time, the World Bank has promoted privatization as kind of one of the biggest solutions to, or not biggest solutions, but a primary solution to improving water access, specifically in developing countries. And there have been several instances where they have given loans to African countries, but only on the condition that they privatize their water systems. And the World Bank's argument for this is that privatization improves efficiency and innovation in the water sector. But some problems with privatization is that privatization is inherently like for-profit thing. And so investors will tend to want to invest more heavily in areas where they're sure that they can get a financial return, which tends to include wealthier neighborhoods or regions because they're more likely to be able to pay their water bills. And additionally, specifically developing countries tend to have less infrastructure to have proper structures in place to regulate private entities and prevent malpractice and exploitation. And so the key questions that my paper asked were, did privatization expand water access in countries in sub-Saharan Africa? And did it have differential impacts on people from different income brackets? And so my paper looked at 4 different countries: Ghana, Tanzania, Mozambique, and Nigeria. And Nigeria never actually had its water system privatized, and so it served as a control study because the British made several attempts to try to incentivize privatization, but its water system was never actually privatized. And then there are kind of 4 main types of privatization, but there are also others. These are just kind of the most common, I think. There's a management contract, a lease, a joint venture, and then a concession, which was not seen in any of these countries. And these all differ in the responsibilities that are given to the private entity versus the government. And so in a management contract, a lease, and a joint venture, the private entity is responsible for managing water quality and then also water bill collection, while the government remains responsible for infrastructure. Whereas in a concession, infrastructure and investment in the water system, as well as management of water quality and water bill collection, are all given to the private entity. But that wasn't seen in any of these countries. And so just some similarities between all these countries were that water privatization only occurred in urban areas. Privatization in all these countries was prompted by strong influence from the World Bank and the IMF, and all the countries that were the private entities that were given control of the water systems in these countries were all either from European companies, from countries that had formerly colonized areas in sub-Saharan Africa, or in the case of Ghana, it was a South African company, but South Africa at the time was much wealthier than Ghana. And so there were two main data sources that were used in this project. The first was the UN Water Sustainable Development Goals data portal. So this gave data on the percentage of the total population in each country that was using improved water sources from the years 2000 to 2017. And then it broke down this data by income level and by national, rural, and urban areas. And I only looked at urban because that's where privatization occurred. And then the second source of data was the USAID demographic and health surveys. And so these are basically nationally representative household surveys, and they ask questions about things related to population characteristics, household assets, health, HIV, and nutrition. And these are really good for cross-country comparison because they use standard data definitions across countries and then across over time as well. And I coded this data in SPSS, and I basically separated out households in urban areas and only looked at that. And then I broke down the variables by income level and then calculated the frequencies for each of the years of interest. And so the variables of interest from this data source were, one, a wealth index, which is kind of how I looked at data by income level, two, the time to water source. And so this was how long it takes to get to a water source, collect water, and come back. And this is for the primary water source for a household. And then also a variable that showed the primary source of drinking water for each of the households. And so just a quick definition before we move on is improved drinking water doesn't mean like a water source that was better than it was last year. It just means like basically it's a way of saying like access to safe water. And so for my results, I'm really only going to go through Ghana because it would take too long to go through every country. But this is what the results look like for the UN Water Sustainable Development Goals. And the black lines indicate the years that privatization occurred. And so you can see that for the percentage of the population with improved water access, it did increase for all income levels, but it had variable results for the poorest income level. And then for the percentage of the population with household connection to drinking water, it pretty much decreased for all income levels, although there wasn't as much of a change for the wealthier income levels. And so this is what the USAID demographic and health data surveys look like. And I only took the data from the poorest and the wealthiest wealth levels, but there's data for the ones in between as well. And the things that are most interesting from this are water piped into dwelling. And you can see that for the poorest income level, it didn't really improve during the course of privatization. And then for the wealthier income level, it slightly decreased, but also there was not really much of a change. And something notable to note is that the use of bottled or sachet water as a primary drinking source actually increased over time. And then, yeah, I don't have time to go through all of these, but you can ask questions about them in the Q&A. And so just some notes about the data is that it was very difficult to use this data because there were inconsistent responses and missing values, which meant that I had to look at different variables for different countries. And not all countries could use the same variables, or they didn't have sufficient data to even come to any conclusions for it. There were also the wealthier income levels tended to have larger sample sizes than the lower income levels, which made the data slightly less reliable for lower income levels. And there was also variation in data quality from year to year. So I wasn't able to look at some variables for certain countries because they didn't have that variable for certain years. And so in conclusion, in Ghana, privatization did not really increase access for any of the income levels. There was a slight increase for the rich. In Tanzania, there was an increase in the unprotected uses of water and unprotected sources of water. So basically just like less safe sources of water. In Tanzania, there was an increase in Mozambique, there was a slight decrease for all income levels in the use of in water access during and after privatization. And in Nigeria, even though it never privatized the management of its water systems, it experienced similar trends in water access to Ghana, with water not really improving for lower income levels and improving gradually for higher income levels, which is more in line with what you see with like an improvement in the economy, or it more corresponded to trends in their political and economic situation. And so basically the data really produced mixed results, but what we could expect to have seen if privatization had a significant positive impact would be consistent and significant increases in water access during and after privatization, but this was not a trend that was present for any of the countries that were studied yeah, like no countries that were studied had a consistent significant increase. And so that indicates that that potentially privatization was at best like ineffective at solving water access. But the study really does point to a need for future research and more thorough data collection, especially on statistics relating to water access, because it's such an increasingly prevalent problem, especially for developing countries. And so, yeah, the fact that this data quality was not very good indicates the need for that improved data collection in that area. And so something interesting to note about all the countries was that they had strong they had very extensive colonial legacies and political instability and ethnic tensions that were primarily caused by legacies of colonialism. And it left a lot of these countries reliant on foreign loans, which was a motivating factor to why they privatized in the first place. And it's also interesting to note that Mozambique had had probably the worst experience with privatization, and they were the last country to gain independence and had the longest colonial legacy of any of the countries that were looked at. And then also a thing that I think influenced the results in this was the type of privatization that was used. So like I said before, and all the forms of privatization were the ones that were used were the ones that gave the least risk to private entities, where the government was still responsible for infrastructure. And infrastructure is one of the biggest things I think that contributes to the lack of water access in all countries, especially developing countries. And none of these forms of privatization gave the responsibility of infrastructure to the private entity and kept that with the government, which may have been a reason why there was not really a strong increase in water access after privatization in any of these countries.
Wow, Asha, really fascinating. That was, so did you, were those the results you expected?
I honestly didn't really have much of an expectation, just because I knew that the data would be difficult and less reliable than I would have liked. And so honestly, I did, my thesis itself has a lot more qualitative research along with it as well, because I think that's where you can make stronger conclusions than from the data. And I think the data in this project more serve to kind of support things that were shown in the literature, just because of the lack of the reliability of it.
Sorry, I'm going to ask you another question, which is, if you had to do it again, would you choose, did you get an inkling on maybe other countries that have done other things? Would you include more types of privatization, or, and what do you think about using Nigeria as the control?
Yeah, so I think I would have liked to explore Nigeria more, just because I think it was a really interesting place. But I was honestly really torn between investigating one country, doing a deep dive into one country, or looking at multiple countries. And the reason I settled on multiple countries for a cross-country comparison was because I thought that the reliability of the data would be so bad that it would help to see if it was a common thing as opposed to just one country, even if it's still not that much. And there's definitely other countries that had privatization that I think I would be interested in looking at, but I think it would be more interesting to look at the anti-privatization movements that happened in Nigeria, because the reason they never privatized was due to a lot of political organizing and activist groups. And so I think that would be a really interesting place for further research as well. Yeah.
Fascinating, thank you. Lest I dominate, we have time for someone else to ask a question. Okay. Oh yes, please, Evan.
Sorry if I missed this earlier on. This was a whirlwind of information here. But I'm wondering about just the scale of this. I mean, you're talking about these countries, but I mean, first of all, it's weird for any country to have a single water provider, I guess, for the entire country, especially, I mean, Mozambique is twice as big as California. Can you talk a little bit more about, I mean, is it the case that Mozambique has a single water district for the entire country, whether it's government or private?
Yeah, so there's so much the difficulty with this presentation was really that I think this topic requires a lot of background information and a lot of a lot of things to be said about this, but so in Mozambique, there were privatization occurred in specific cities, not like it was only in urban areas, and then two, like there were specific cities, and I have the names of them in my actual thesis. And when I was looking at the data, I could actually, like for Mozambique, they did break it down by like cities, so I was able to just take data from the specific cities and then put it all together in one. And so it was the case that there was like a single like entity that was responsible for water provision in those cities. But yeah, I didn't really have time to properly explain that.
No, it's okay. I get it. So is it the same company, the same private organization that was doing water in each of those cities, or did they each have their own?
Yeah, it was the same. It was the same. And
Okay.
this was a joint venture, so it was kind of there were two large companies that were working together on it. It wasn't just one private company.
Okay. Okay.
Really interesting, Asha. Thank you for that. I've really learned a lot on that one. And in the interest of time, I think that we will end it there for the first session. So thank you. Let's give a round of applause for all of our speakers this morning and their talks about environment, agriculture, and health. And we will take a short break, I believe.
Yeah, we're going to
tell us what's up.
Well, we're going to keep the same, we're using the same link, right, Julie? So I think you can just mute, stop video, and come back at 10:30.